Theo Yesund, and welcome back to the Revolts podcast. I am your host, James King, and I will be taking you into the depths of social strife in England from the early Middle Ages all the way through to the early modern period. In the last episode, we covered the period from the reign of Alfred through the unification of England and into the reign of England's Viking kings. We broke off the last episode with Harold I on the throne, having seized power from Emma's progeny by murdering Alfred Atheling. Emma is now in exile in Bruges, Flanders, and Harthacnut is still stuck in Scandinavia. Today we will cover the return of Harthacnut and tell the story of a revolt in Worcester in 1041. Yes, I know this one predates Hereward's revolt by 30 years, but I hope you're enjoying the winding path I have chosen as much as I am. After the Worcester revolt, we will move on to Edward the Confessor's reign, discussing the Northumbrian revolt and the role of the English mercenaries abroad. So let's get back to the narrative. Harold would rule the kingdom as a whole until 1040. In this year, Harthacnut finally felt secure enough in Scandinavia to return to England. In a fortunate turn of events for Harthacnut, Harold fell gravely ill and died, leading to Harthacnut being invited to return and take the crown. He returned to England with his mother in June 1040. Based on the invitation, you would think this would be peaceable. Indeed, the powerful earls would not contest their returning monarch. However, there was bad blood between Harthacnut and Godwin, who would be put on trial for his turning over of Alfred. But Godwin would be allowed to retain his life, limbs, and land, only parting with a wergild, a practice dating back as far as 500 AD, where compensation is paid for a life taken. Godwin was likely acquitted, as Harthacnut needed his powerful southern base of support, but the payment was possibly paid to sate the vengeful spirit of Emma. So you ask, why was it not a peaceable return? Harthacnut's response seems pretty forgiving and reasonable. Well, Harthacnut may have been invited and returned without violence. However, he had prepared to invade, raising a great army. Initially, he likely retained this army due to the uncertainty of Harold's survival, but he could have been acting out of self-defense or fear for his own safety. Concerns over how the powerful earls would respond to his return seem valid to me. Leofric had supported Harold outright, Godwin had betrayed Harthacnut's claim, and they had certainly conspired to murder Alfred and attempted to do so with Edward. So how would Harthacnut treat them as king? Maybe the smart move would be to lure him back without his army and slaughter him. Whatever the cause of this decision, Harthacnut returned with 62 ships. Compared to England's standing fleet of 16 ships, this was a massive amount, which required a lot of resources to maintain. And how could Harthacnut support this vast fleet? It could only be done through reaching deep into the English population's pockets, exacting £21,000 in taxation in his first year and £11,000 in his second year. This is difficult to translate into modern economics, but to try and put it into perspective, the basic income tax rate in the UK as of July 2024 is 20%. If the government were to increase income tax as much as Harthacnut increased his, 80% of your income would be paid as income tax. The tax unleashed by Harthacnut devastated the English economy, causing the first recorded instance of price inflation, as reported by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles entry for 1039. The Chronicle reports, and in this same year came Harthacnut to Sandwich 7 days before midsummer, and he was soon acknowledged as well as by English as by Danes, though his advisers afterwards grievously requited it, when they decreed that 72 ships should be retained in pay, at the rate of 8 marks for each rower, and in this same year the cester of wheat went up to 55 pence, and even further. I've been trying to research a way to compare this to today's prices, but it turns out to be incredibly complex or even impossible. To start with, there seems to be no consensus on how big a cester was. The word comes from the Roman sextarius, which roughly means a pint, but a cester is thought to be larger. Bannerman Faith's book, Anglo-Saxon Farms and Farming, suggests it is possibly around a bushel, but I've seen other sources suggest it was as much as 12 or even 16 bushels. The pence was also different. It was introduced back in Offa's day in a direct copy of Charlemagne, with 240 pence to the pound, the ratio that stuck until decimalisation in 1971. That's around 1,200 years of the same pence to pound ratio, which has slightly blown my mind having been born after decimalisation. Another difficulty in comparing is that we have no price records of wheat before 1039. Before this point, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is remarkably quiet on these sorts of economics in comparison to the deaths of various churchmen. I mean, seriously, for 1034, all we have is this year died Bishop Etherich, who lies at Ramsey. The chroniclers mostly record what happens to churchmen, the acts of kings, and big events such as famines. We have to remember that the chronicle is, of course, written by churchmen, so they mostly record what impacts them. The fact that the wheat price had so affected our chronicler that they thought to record it shows its significance. During the Anglo-Saxon period, there was a steady trend away from hulled varieties of wheat, such as spelt and emmer. These varieties require extra work to remove the chaff from the grain before milling, often by heating, pounding, or soaking. The free threshing varieties that we know today as bread wheat need less processing, and a miller can take them almost as soon as they are threshed. However, the lower classes likely would not have received much of the bread produced by these grains. Certainly in the later Middle Ages, this superior bread wheat was the reserves of the rich, including the clergy. We cannot be certain of the impact of the rise in wheat prices on the rest of the population in 1039. However, we can be certain that 5 years later, in 1044, grain prices rose to 60 pence and even further as a direct consequence of demand outstripping supply, while England was plunged into what the chronicler describes as a very great hunger. It seems very unlikely to me that those growing the bread wheat in 1039 would control the prices, so I doubt that they saw any windfall profits. Uncertain economics, overtaxation, and hunger do breed resentment, and it certainly seems to have done so in 1041. So on our winding road to introduce Hereward's Revolt, here we will stop to examine another popular uprising in Worcester, which started as a consequence of the astronomical taxation we have mentioned and the resultant inflation in prices. The revolt is captured in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and expanded upon in the Chronicon ex Chronicis, written in the 12th century by John of Worcester, a monk of Worcester Priory with inspiration from another monk named Florence. I just can't skip such an interesting episode that, although little known, has echoed down the centuries with later disturbances against unpopular taxation and inflation all the way through to the 1990s. Shire reeves, or as they would later be called sheriffs, generally collected taxation in England. But in 1041, Harthacnut dispatched housecarls to carry out taxation. A shire reeve was generally a lower rank officer that served a king or lord on matters involving the lower classes, and as such was often more of a local official. In contrast, a housecarl is more akin to a military role, sometimes serving as a Danish king's or lord's bodyguard. Housecarls in this case were employed in the role of collecting what is known as a herregeld, which is what we might call an army tax. You can imagine that anyone collecting a tax isn't likely to make themselves popular. On top of that, these are military figures from a different class that represent foreign occupiers who were charging the population for occupying them, even though they had already suffered under great price hikes that had diminished their wealth and well-being greatly. But you might ask, if Danish housecarls are collecting the tax, are we sure Worcestershire would see them as an other, or of the same stock as themselves? The answer is that it is difficult to know exactly. The cultural makeup of any one settlement during this period cannot be given with any certainty. Worcestershire was ostensibly an English county in Mercia on the English side of Watling Street. Yet we know from St. Brice's day that Danes did live west of Watling Street, and in a charter of 1006 after the massacre, Athelred had sold land to the Danes. Furthermore, with over 20 years of Danish occupation, you would think that line in the sand would have been blasted away, but there is little evidence that the Danish occupation had been accompanied by a replacement of landowners in Worcestershire. At the time of the Domesday Book in 1086, there were 20 pre-conquest landowners in Worcestershire with Scandinavian names. They held very little land in comparison to their English counterparts. It is also possible that these landholders came to Worcestershire at a later date than 1040, and we unfortunately cannot take Scandinavian names to mean for certain that they hailed from Scandinavia. Many Anglo-Saxons or mixed families gave their children Scandinavian names, including famously Earl Godwin's first four sons, Swegan, Harold, Tostig, and Gurth. This was likely due to his Danish wife's influence, but the pattern could have been repeated anywhere to attempt to fit in with the new Danish leadership. It seems likely then that Worcestershire retained an English cultural identity in this period. It is against this backdrop that Feeder and Thurston arrived in 1041 to extract the Herogeld from Worcester. The Prosopography of Anglo-Saxon England, or PASE, is an excellent database that was created by the universities of Oxford, Cambridge, King's College London, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and the Leverhulme Trust, in order to provide structured information relating to all the recorded inhabitants of England from the late 6th to the late 11th century. According to PASE, the name Feeder is clearly of Scandinavian origin. Thurston, on the other hand, is an interesting name. The discussion I can find on the name seems unsure as to its origins. The first half Thur could be a reference to the well-known Scandinavian god Thor, but it could also originate from the equivalent English god Thunor, whose name is the origin of the day of the week Thursday, which dropped the N under Scandinavian influence. The second half Stan is used in other English names, such as Athelstan or Wulfstan, who we've already met, and means stone or rock. However, there is a Scandinavian equivalent Stein, which has the same meaning. The name could instead be a reference to the Suffolk town of Thurston, which is recorded in the Domesday Book. The town name derives from an Old Norse personal name, Thori, and the English word for settlement, Tun. Whatever the root of his name, Thurston seems to me to be an example of how deeply the cultures had entwined both in their Germanic ancestry and their new medieval entanglement. Thurston and Feeder must have known that the role that they played was a dangerous one. It seems that they would face worse than they expected. But what did they face on that day? Well, Worcester is an ancient settlement dating back to before the Roman period, with evidence of an Iron Age settlement. Worcester's location was important because of its place on the River Severn and the road between Droitwich and Gloucester, making it part of the trading network. There is not much that we can say with certainty about Worcester in the Roman period. According to a conservation management plan of Worcester city defences produced by Oxford Archaeology, extensive Roman deposits have been discovered. There was certainly a road running near where Newport Street is now, and it also at least had a defensive ditch and possibly wooden ramparts. It was a small town that may have been named Virtus, representing its place on a bend in the river. The river would form the defensive structure on the west of the Roman town, with ditches, we think, running around the north, west, and south. It seems that this was enough for the Anglo-Saxons to believe that it had been a Roman military camp or fort, for they named it Viogorna Siastra, which is the root of our modern name for the city. Siastra comes, similarly to other cities, from the Roman word castrum adopted into Old English. Weogoran refers to the people who occupied the area, a part of the Hwicker people who we have previously discussed. It means the people of the winding river, which is oddly similar to the possible Roman name Virtus, though I'm not sure whether there's a connection or truly the winding river is just the most important aspect of the land. The constant flooding of the county cricket ground certainly seems to emphasise the importance of the river and its floodplain in Worcester. During the Anglo-Saxon period, the city grew in its importance, becoming the capital of the Hwicker and the site of a cathedral in 680. The city expanded beyond its Roman extent and became vulnerable to Scandinavian attack before being reorganised into the system of boroughs by the Lady of the Mercens Athelflaed, in a similar process to her father Alfred the Great's boroughs. This work extended the defences to add a ditch and bank to the north and continue the eastern ditch, which were likely topped with a wooden palisade. By the 11th century, the town had grown even more. A second cathedral was built in 983, which looks like it stood alongside the earlier cathedral. Both of these were later replaced with the present building that was started in 1089. The late 11th century would also see the building of a bridge upstream of the current bridge in the place where a bridge was demolished in 1781. The placement of the Roman road mentioned previously strongly suggests a river crossing existed in that same place beforehand. Whether this was a bridge, ferry crossing, or ford is unknown. How Feeder and Thurston approached Worcester is also unknown. They could have come up or down the Severn or used the river crossing. But my guess would be that as housecarls, they would have travelled from Harthacnut's capital, Winchester, approaching from the southeast. This would have taken them first through the outskirts of the city that was spilling over into an area known as Sidbury, leading them towards a gap in the Roman defensive system and out into the area housing the two cathedrals. Feeder and Thurston coming into the town and demanding payment of the Herogeld enraged the people of Worcester. It is said that to escape the tumult, they concealed themselves in an upper chamber of the Abbey Tower. We cannot be certain which cathedral the Abbey Tower is referring to. What we do know is that hiding would do them no good. John of Worcester and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle report that both were slain within that tower on the 4th of May, 1041. The fact that they were both killed on consecrated ground is significant. England at the time was a deeply Christian place, and Worcester was one of the most powerful ecclesiastical seats in England. At either of Worcester's cathedrals, or indeed any consecrated ground, someone could claim sanctuary from the law for 40 days with ecclesiastical protection. We can also see how shocked the nation was later on in 1170 when Thomas Becket was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral. It was not just the murder of a holy man, but the place of his murder that was significant within the consecrated grounds. Taking the step of murdering two royal representatives in a cathedral is incredibly important, both to understanding how angry the population was and the response that followed from Harthacnut. As a son of the pious Canute the Great, an important religious figure himself, and a warrior, politically, Harthacnut had little choice but to respond with force, and it appears he responded with brutality. John of Worcester reports, "This so incensed the king that to avenge their deaths he sent Thorold, Earl of Middlesex, Leofric, Earl of Mercia, Godwin, Earl of Wessex, Cywood, Earl of Northumbria, Bonny, Earl of Hereford, and all the other English earls, with almost all his housecarls, and a large body of troops to Worcester, where Alfric was still bishop, with orders to put to death all the inhabitants that they could find, to plunder and burn the city, and lay waste to the whole province." Although it is impossible to tell how large the body of troops was, the list of earls includes all the most powerful men in the country besides the king himself. It seems like a huge reaction to the murder of two housecarls. Harthacnut's wrath would have to wait though. It is unclear why, but the host did not reach Worcester until the 12th of November. It is possible that it took time to raise the host, as the lords and housecarls were busy collecting the tax elsewhere, or that other events such as the Great Hunger had an impact on the gathering of the host. This delay, as we shall see, may have been crucial to the outcome of the revolt. The Chronicon reports that the people of Worcester had received notice of the progress of the host before they reached the area, enabling them to establish a defensive position on an isle in the River Severn named Beveridge, about 4 kilometres northwest of Worcester. The island is now known as Bevery, spelled Bevere, but pronounced like the word Every, and it is made up of the melding of two Old English words, beaver and idge. The first is the animal, which must have inhabited the area, and the second is a word for island, so Beaver Island. It is common for place names in England to have an Old English form ending in idge that in modern English was replaced by a Y-sounding ending, such as the Isle of Sheppey, which was Sheepidge, and Mersey Island, which was Merseyage. If they had retained their original ending, we would have called them tautological place names. That is, place names with at least two different sounding parts that are actually synonyms. One example is Torpenhoe Hill, in which all four elements, tor, pen, ho, and hill, could all be roughly translated as hill. So we have hill, 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 hill. Another is the River Avon. As Avon is Brythonic for river, it is the river. The root of the name is derived similarly to the place name Beverley, which refers to a clearing in a wood inhabited by beavers. The English surname Beveridge most likely comes from the name of a family that lived on the island, and the island was later used as a refuge from the plague in 1637. But in 1041 it was occupied and fortified by the people of Worcester. It is easy to see why it was such a strong position to defend. It is now a fast-flowing section of the river, although if beavers were present still in 1041, it may have been a lot slower. Either way, the king's men would have either been bottlenecked through a bridge, had to ford the river and attack up a steep bank, or gathered watercraft in enough numbers to put a significant amount of men across the river. With heavy equipment, this would have been quite an undertaking. But before Harthacnut's men attacked the camp, they carried out the second and third wishes of the king, plundering and burning the city and laying waste to all of Worcestershire. After the arrival of the royal force, the revolt continued for only 5 days more. A timeline of these 5 days cannot be pieced together. Certainly a large part of the time was spent laying waste to the city and countryside, but John of Worcester also implies that the island was assaulted, stating that the people of the revolt defended themselves so stoutly against their enemies that they obtained terms of peace and were allowed free liberty to return home. The North Glens Parish Council states that the sacking of the city took place before 4 attacks on the island, which made no grounds, resulting in a truce. However, I cannot seem to find a reference for this claim, and the website also claims this took place in 1051, which is possibly a typo but leads me to disregard the claims. Our two sources, John of Worcester and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, don't mention these details. Interestingly, the amount of supposed attacks matches the number of days that the force stayed around the area before leaving. It seems that the earls believed that the plunder they had taken and the havoc that they had wreaked on Worcestershire was enough to satiate Harthacnut. They were correct. John notes that everyone marched off loaded with plunder, and the king's wrath was satisfied. In addition, the terms of peace that they had agreed to seemed to have quelled any further unrest in the area that may have taken place. The next mentions of Worcester in the Chronicon and the Chronicle are in relation to the bishops of Worcester and a great earthquake in 1048. And there ends the events of our first revolt, dissolving into the threads of history with causes, reactions, and tactics that reappear in later major historical events. The riots in 1990 were caused by the Thatcher government's poll tax. England would go through a great trauma with the murder of Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170, and in 1644, during the First English Civil War, Royalist forces would hold out and be relieved from parliamentarian attack in the fortress town of Newark, whose strongest defence was its situation on an island in the River Trent. Due to the lack of source evidence around Worcestershire during this period, the localised effects of the revolt are hard to trace. We can be certain that the economic causes of the revolt were felt throughout England, and the punishment planned for the people of Worcestershire is evocative of the more famous harrying of the North imposed upon Northumbria by William from 1069 to 1070. This later harrying would severely affect the population, causing starvation and destitution for the people of Northumbria. We know in Worcestershire that not many died at the swords of the earls, but nevertheless, the plunder of their possessions, destruction of their food stores, and burning of their crops, especially at a time after the harvest, would have done great damage to an already hungry and poor population. It is difficult to compare the two, as we have little to go on in source evidence, but by the time of the Doomsday Book 40 years later, in 1086, it seems Worcestershire had recovered. In the upper classes, we see the tensions between the great men of the kingdom continue to escalate after the revolt. Harthacnut did not appreciate the English style of rule by a council of the leading men of the realm, referred to as the Witenagemot or Witan. He was a hands-on, autocratic ruler who didn't trust the country's leading men, though clearly he did trust them enough to let them put down the revolt without his presence. This could have been because he had been counselled to not attend, so as not to give the revolt credence, or possibly his presence as a Dane would have further enraged those already in revolt. Either way, the ability of Worcestershire to defy the king without the support of a great lord or a mass of armed men, and the king's reliance on the earls, is likely to have emboldened the leading men of the kingdom. This balance of power will continue to plague Harthacnut and his successor Edward the Confessor, leading to a revolt in Northumbria and crescendoing into Godwin's son Harold Godwinson being named Harold II for a brief period, before Duke William would smash the power of the English earls and dismantle the elites of the kingdom. But let's not get into that today. We've got all that to come in the next few episodes as we keep building up to Hereward's revolt. In this episode, we primarily followed the 1041 entries in the Chronicon ex Chronicus and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, also considering evidence from the Domesday Book, a conservation management plan of Worcester city defences produced by Oxford Archaeology, Bannerman Faith's book Anglo-Saxon Farms and Farming, the prosopography of Anglo-Saxon England project, Worcester Cathedral records, and of course Mark Morris's The Norman Conquest. As before, please do find extra material on the various social media pages. Just search for Revolt's podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and X or Twitter. We now also have a website at revoltspodcast.buzzsprout.com. So thank you for listening to this episode, and Wes Thu Hal. Catch you in 1042.